Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the current status of the accredited employer work visa system, accreditation, renewals, breaches, what's happening out there in the market, people trying to vary their job conditions to be able to work for new employers, and we'll talk about potentially some changes coming and what we think should happen in the future. Now, what prompted me to make this video was there's some posts online claiming that it takes 10 months to support a migrant for a visa. 10 months. This is strange. Just a few years ago when we had the essential skills work visa system, you could potentially hire somebody and have them working within the month, right? Because you'd lodge the application, it would be assessed depending on volumes of visa processing, maybe a couple of weeks. We've seen some get approved in a few days in the past. 10 months now. How does that work? Well, I'm going to explain what this really means. And the reason that the 10-month figure comes out there is because if you are a company who has never hired a migrant before, you've never gone through any visa process before, and now you find yourself wanting to support somebody from overseas, it actually may take you up to 10 months. It's scary, but here's how it works. Number one, you have to go through the accreditation process. Now, assuming that you're good with your documentation and assuming that your accreditation, you're eligible for the accreditation and you lodge an application, this accreditation application can take, at the moment, current processing time on the immigration website, 10, 11 weeks. Okay, so there's 3 months there. Wow. Now, once you've got accredited, then you can lodge an application for a job token, right? This is called the job check, right? They do the labor market testing, check your advertisements or whatever. And the wait time for those tokens is also currently sitting on the immigration website up to 3 months. Wow, so now you've got 6 months just to get to that token. Once you've received the token, then you can lodge an application for a work visa, only then. And looking at the current processing times for that on the immigration website, this stretches out from the beginning until the end to actually 10 months. Now, does that mean that every application or every visa or everything will take that long? No, it doesn't. We're talking about averages and processing volumes, which can change over time. But from my opinion, this is ridiculous. This is just absolutely horrible. This is not a system that is working, okay? This is a failed system, in my opinion. Now, just because it's a failed system, does it mean that we shouldn't use it? Does it mean that we should give up? No, it doesn't. We can, of course, find ways around it. And of course, there are things that you can do to prevent having to wait so long. Of course, you get your accreditation sorted out early before you may need to support somebody. Perhaps even when it comes to job tokens, if you can look forward into your company's future over the next 12 months and assess your requirements, and even if you may not have a migrant in mind that you want to hire, you could actually apply for those job tokens early, right? So that is there as well. Now, of course, this is where there's been abuse in the system, and so immigration is obviously watching very closely if people are just applying for tokens that they don't need. But this is something you can do if you estimate that you may have some requirements for labour in the future. Now, really what Immigration New Zealand wants you to do is hire locals. This is really what they're asking, is hire New Zealanders. But for the people watching this who might be interested in visas, that doesn't make sense. We want to find out how we can get a visa. So let's talk about the accreditation in general and how to maintain accreditation, how to make sure that you're actually able to get a visa through this accredited employer work visa system. Now, what we're seeing out in the market at the moment, and now being October 2024, is we're seeing immigration coming down hard and strict on the accreditation renewals. Okay, so many people who run a company have had their accreditation granted 1 or 2 years ago, simply by completing the form and applying online, and it was actually quite straightforward at the time. And we were telling people, hey, be careful because there's some requirements. You're going to have to, demonstrate that you've met those requirements when you renew. And now here we are, 1-2 years later, where companies are trying to renew their accreditation and they're having difficulty. Okay. Now there are a few things that are coming up. The number one thing that's coming up is that the employers have not completed the employment modules. Okay, so when you've signed up for accreditation, you've declared that you will complete these online employment modules, which are really just to demonstrate that you know and understand the basics of employment law, and compliance, right? So if you're an accredited employer, somebody in your company at least needs to complete this and get a certificate. If you haven't done it and you've applied for accreditation renewal, then immigration is going to come back and ask you, okay, why didn't you do it? What's your reasoning? Now, they shouldn't be too strict on this. They're supposed to be reasonable about it, but they're looking for compliance. They're looking for an employer that's a good employer. And you've signed something that said you would do it, so you should do it. And if you haven't done it and there's a genuine, credible reason, okay, that's fine. But this is one thing that's coming up. That's the first thing. The second thing is related to what they call the settlement services, or advice to your migrant workers. If you have hired somebody and they've obtained an accredited employer work visa, there's an obligation that you provide them the information related to those employment modules as well, so that they understand about settlement in New Zealand. I thought this was a little bit of an interesting thing when they introduced this policy, because they're trying to place a kind of a burden on employers to help migrants understand what it means to live in New Zealand, right? How to live here. And I suppose that's fair if you're bringing somebody in from overseas. But in many cases, employers are hiring someone who's already in New Zealand. Maybe you've studied here, or you've already been working here or traveled here. So it's a little bit, extra, but it's not that hard to do. They'll be looking for evidence that you've sent an email to them saying, here's a link and here's what you have to do, right? So this is the second thing that's coming up. The third thing that's coming up is possible breaches, okay? So where an employer may have breached accreditation requirements. And these breaches can be many things, but one of the ones that we're seeing a lot is where maybe an employer has more than one business. And perhaps you've got, let's say, 3 companies with 3 retail stores or 3 restaurants, and you get one of those companies accredited and you get a work visa for one company, but then maybe the other one is short on staff one day. And so you say, okay, can you just go and work in that one for the day or for 1 week? Now, if that happens, and if immigration sees that that's happening, this is a breach. You're actually breaking the law, because that applicant holds a visa for company A, they cannot work for company B. We understand very much that the realities of business are such that it's efficient to have companies working across different entities. And under normal circumstances, if somebody is a citizen or a resident or with an open visa, these things never really become an issue, because we can, you can work around through sort of intercompany contracting arrangements. Many employment agreements have a clause that say, the employer may require you to work in a different location at some time, as is reasonable, and as long as the person gets paid properly and is responsible, there's responsibility taken for that person under employment law, in most cases it can be okay. But when they have a visa that's linked to one company, it's just not allowed. That's when instead of the normal accreditation, you may need to look at a restructure of your business profile, perhaps to have some centralized entity which is accredited, which is then accredited and allowed to send people out to other locations under what they call like a third-party controlling party relationship, right? And there's a special type of accreditation you can apply for that. So that's one example of a breach. There are other breaches, such as you have not given the worker 30 hours as per their contract, or as per the visa requirement. They must have 30 hours per week. They're not supposed to work less than that. Or where you may have perhaps not paid correctly, or paid wages and holiday time, all these things correctly. So these things come into play because there's an overarching responsibility to follow employment law and compliance relating to immigration, employment, and all the related things. So the visa really ties you in as an employer to an extra layer of responsibility. And these breaches are coming up. Now, the other main thing that we're seeing coming up as a problem for accreditation is simply just the eligibility criteria for accreditation. Okay, now the responsibility for an employer on compliance and everything, that's one thing, but the eligibility criteria based on your financial position, based on being a genuinely operating business, this is where we're seeing people come unstuck. Okay, so there are 4 main criteria, and you can fit one or the other, right? Any of those 4, but you have to demonstrate that you fit one of them. Okay, now the first one is simply that you have not made a loss in the last 2 years. Okay, Now, therefore, if your company is profitable and your financial statement, which is reported to the IRD, demonstrates profit, then in a very straightforward and simple way, you can demonstrate that you meet the financial criteria under the first one. Many companies have not made profit in the last 2 years. It's been tough. There was COVID, cost of living is going up, wages are going up, and it's just a reality that some companies operate at a book loss, okay? The company may itself be totally financially sustainable, but it has made a financial loss on the reporting statement to IRD. So in that case, we look at the second option. Has the company at least got positive cash flow in the last 6 months? Now, under this second option, positive cash flow in the last 6 months means positive cash flow in each of the last 6 months. Now, how do we prove that? Well, you would have a sort of a cash flow statement. They can look at your GST returns in and out of the flow of money. So that way, even if there might be a loss on paper on the financial statements, immigration can then see that at least the company is currently trading in positive cash flow, okay? Because, a financial loss on the paper can be made through things like depreciation of assets, claims of other losses brought forward. There are other ways that a company can make a financial loss while it's still actually technically profitable according to the cash flow. So that's the second option, positive cash flow in 6 months. Now, it's also just a reality that sometimes in 1 month, a company makes a negative cash flow. So for example, you might have a business where you have big sales every 3 months, but for the remaining 2 months, your cash flow is down. You're just spending the money that you've earned in that 1 month. So you have spikes, peaks and troughs of your cash flow. So in that case, we have to look at the third criteria, which is a little bit more broad. And they say, okay, so you've made a financial loss, your cash flow is not positive, but do you have at least sufficient capital? Okay, sufficient capital means cash, right? Money in the bank. Maybe your company is making a financial loss every year of $50,000, and maybe the cash flow in the last 6 months is not strong because you have like once a year big cash flow and revenue, but not in the last 6 months. Like for example, project-based companies like builders or architects. But your company's got $1 million in a term deposit. It's all available, or you've got a checking account with $500,000 sitting there as capital that's owned by the company. That's pretty clear. The company can still survive because immigration will be able to look at all of the financial situation, the whole arrangement of your company, and holistically they can assess, all right, so you're making a financial loss, cash flows up and down, but you've got loads of cash. Wonderful. Now, on this point, I would comment that we have seen some situations where the owner of the company holds sufficient financial resources in their personal name, and in many cases this is satisfactory as long as we can demonstrate that the funds will be available to the business. There's some specific parts of the policy that immigration officers are looking for, but they need to be satisfied that the funds are available for the business, that it's capital for the business. So we have actually seen some cases where immigration officers are refusing to accept the owner's personal financial capacity as evidence of capital for the business. For example, in one particular case, we had a client who the director and shareholder held a term deposit. And the term deposit has a maturity date, but of course the maturity date is not forever, it's not long in the future, it's coming up in some future time that's close by. And so the immigration officer may think, okay, well, that's fine, you've got a term deposit, but what are you going to do with that money at the end of the maturity date of the term deposit? Where's it going? How can we be sure that that money is going to be available for the business? And so, of course, the owner of the company will write a statement and declare that this is available, but immigration officers, we have seen sometimes they don't accept it easily. So because they're looking at it holistically, they're looking at the whole picture. How much money does the business have, the person who owns the business, how much do they have, what's realistic under the circumstances, right? So then we have, if that's not satisfied and there's not sufficient capital, we need to look at the last fourth option, which is the one which a lot of businesses are now getting approved under, and that is immigration will accept if you can demonstrate a credible 2-year plan, okay? 2 years. So that means if you're applying today, October 2024, they want to see right the way through to October 2026. Now, how do you demonstrate a credible plan for the future? How do you do that? Like, what do they really want to see? And what does it mean to be credible? So you can go to your accountant and you can say, hey, please give me a cash flow projection for 2 years. And your accountant will look at the last 2 years' performance and cash flow, and then your accountant will try to project forward what that looks like based on your expenses and your revenue and all these things. But is immigration just going to simply accept that? Are they going to simply just say, oh, okay, wonderful, your accountant has given you a cash flow projection, let's accept that? Probably not. They're going to assess it holistically. They're going to consider what you've told them about your plan, why you think it can be achieved. And I'll give you an example of what I would be suggesting to some businesses is that in addition to your cash flow statement, you want to be backing this up with some evidence, like let's say you're a restaurant and you would then, maybe you would write a statement about how you've survived over the last 2 years during COVID, how the wage subsidies helped you if you survived through the wage subsidy period, how you've struggled with staff, but what's your plan for achieving, filling those holes of staff. You would maybe analyze the last 3 months, and you'd analyze last year at the next 3 months, these things, and you'd say, okay, last year revenue in December was down because we had a road closure due to the roadworks, for example, but this year the road is open again, and here's a link to the local council article which is explaining about the things that are going on in December. Maybe you would say, next year we have, let's say we've got a loan on the business, okay, and the loan will be paid off in full by next year. And because the loan will be paid off in full, that's going to be easy on our cash flow. We will not have to pay our, monthly loan balance. You might also have created a new menu recently, and maybe you've started a new marketing campaign. Maybe you've got a new contracted marketing specialist who's helping you out, and you're doing some Facebook and Instagram, and that you're growing in followers. So you would point to all of these things that you're doing in the background to actually support the cash flow projection. In other words, simply writing the numbers on a spreadsheet and saying next year I'm going to earn this much and the following year that much is not enough. You will need to actually provide some kind of evidence, story, some credible reasons as to why that's going to work. And you really, really want to put effort into this, because if you don't meet the first three criteria, the fourth one is the last option you have, okay? It's the last option for resolving the accreditation problem. Okay, so now having talked about that, what do you do if your accreditation is declined? If you try to renew your accreditation and it's declined, what do you do? Now, first of all, if you have visa holders currently working for you, they can continue to work. Their visa was granted based on the accreditation in place at the time. Even if you lose your accreditation, you don't reapply or it's rescinded or whatever, they can still continue working for you. Even if there were breaches or whatever, it's not going to negatively impact the visa holder themselves right away. However, if you have current job tokens that you want to use to try to hire somebody else, they will disappear because you don't have accreditation. If you have applications in process, here's where you have a problem, because an application in process cannot be normally finalized if you're not accredited. This is where we're having a lot of complaints from our employer clients who are struggling with the accreditation renewals. Can you imagine that you've been waiting for 4 months to get a job token for somebody, and then now you're waiting another 2 or 3 months for the visa application? Maybe you've been waiting 6 months to employ somebody in your company that needs staff and that you can't find from the local market. You've been waiting for 6 months, and during that process you need to renew your accreditation, and then this happens and you have a problem that you can't renew because of unable to get all the documents together and to prove this 2-year plan. How frustrating would that be? So not only have you spent all the money to do the job check and get the token, you've spent the money to support the worker, you've waited in the meantime, you've spent money to try to get accreditation. You might have spent thousands and thousands of dollars. You waited 6 months, and now all of a sudden your accreditation is not being renewed. the short answer from Immigration New Zealand, whenever we ask them, is they don't care. It's almost like they want companies to struggle, because when you struggle and cannot support visa holders, then you're forced to hire in the local labour market. And I suppose in some cases there are companies who need this push, right? There are some companies out there who are serial migrant exploiters. They constantly are only hiring migrants from their own community, or they're taking advantage of migrants, or they're even selling jobs and things like that. And so this attitude from Immigration New Zealand, in some ways, it solves that problem for those bad actors, because it forces them either to shut down or to just hire locals and operate their business properly. But it's kind of like that whole throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because now you have a large number of genuine operators. These are genuine businesses who are just thriving and struggling to stay alive. They're striving to continue their business properly and genuinely. They're following the law. They're doing everything properly. They just struggle to get together all the paperwork required. They struggle to demonstrate and prove, and maybe immigration has a high threshold. They're being too strict, and now it's going to be even worse for them. And they're faced with, in some cases, maybe even business closure, because if you can't get staff, how can you run your business? So that's a little bit dire. And I don't want to sound too negative, but maybe now let's talk about what I think can happen to fix and change all of this. We do know that there's some discussion going on in immigration with the policy team and at the higher levels. We do know that there's work being done to try to solve the problems. We know that. I don't like to come on here and just talk badly about immigration all day, although there's a lot to say these days about the system. But we know that there's work being done. For example, here's one piece of work that we know that's going on, and that is, when one business takes over another one, like you buy a company or you buy a shop, and there are existing workers. In the past, we would just submit a variation of conditions, and within a few weeks they would have a visa. They can start working for the new owner. But now that new owner has to get accredited, has to go through a job check, re-advertise the position, placing those workers at risk of losing their job. And even though they may have a visa for 3 years, because there's a new owner coming, they may now be waiting for 5 or 6 months and they cannot work for the new owner yet. This is a problem. We know that immigration is looking into this and trying to find a solution for this. The solution that I have is potentially to look at another type of visa in the interim. There's a type of visa called a specific purpose visa. There are some problems with trying to get it into one of the categories, and there's an issue around this concept of it being a time-bound visa. It's normally for some specific project or purpose. But in cases like this, we're starting to look at these alternative options to help people solve the short-term problem to roll over the business change. But that's one example of how immigration may make some changes. The other thing that has been bandied around, which I very much support, is throwing away the system altogether. I would love it if they just threw away the accredited employer system altogether. In fact, in my opinion, they never should have brought it in. And the reason I say that is because our company we have office in Auckland, our head office in Auckland. Also, we have an office in Melbourne. We have a satellite office in Sydney as well. And we do Australian visas as well as New Zealand visas. Today, we're talking about New Zealand visas, but we can talk a lot about Australia because we know the policies over there as well. And Immigration New Zealand seems to have copied Australia. In Australia, there's sponsorship and nomination, and these things are expensive and it takes time and it's complex. And so I think they've looked at that and they've thought, oh, we like that system, let's implement that in New Zealand. Makes sense, but there's one thing that they have not thought about, I believe, and that is that in Australia, there are just so many other programs. Number one, there are so many other programs. There's so many other ways to get a visa other than through the sponsorship and nomination. Number two, Australia has so many migrants who are sitting there on open visas through various other ways, right, that are just not available in New Zealand. For example, if you've had a declined application for your visa, and then you can actually appeal that declined temporary visa in Australia. You go through the appeal, the tribunal, and while you're appealing, you could even be granted a bridging visa with working rights. Now in New Zealand, if you get a declined visa, you can't appeal it, and if your visa runs out, your interim visa runs out, you can't work, you're unlawful. There's just nothing to do. There's no option for you. Whereas in Australia, there are options. The Australian government has left a big open gap for many, many people to be working on open work rights. So they fill those spaces, they get those jobs employers don't struggle as much as they do in New Zealand now, because here in New Zealand with this accredited employer work visa system, you know, if you're not able to wait for 6 to 8 months to get your visa approved, you lose your job, and then there's no job, and the company can't find workers. They have problems. So this is where New Zealand has gone wrong. They've tried to emulate and model the system in Australia in some way, which is a good system and can work, but they failed to understand that Australia has so many other options. Australia has a much bigger system, so many more people. The labour shortage gaps can be filled with other people. And you know, funny enough, where those labour shortage gaps are being filled right now, New Zealanders in large numbers are moving to Australia, filling in the labour shortage gaps in Australia. So Australia doesn't have to worry so much about how hard the visa is as much as New Zealand does. So New Zealand is now suffering from a loss of good workers to Australia. They're suffering from a system that doesn't work. It's failed and doesn't get visas approved on time and allows too much fraud. And there's no other way to fill that gap. Where do we fill that gap from? So instead it implodes. Look, there's no need to keep going on philosophically about it. These are just my thoughts. I don't want to sound like a broken record or like I'm just complaining about the system. This is really just to give you all an update and an understanding about what's going on. There has to be a change. Something has to come to fix this problem. And the problem is not just for migrants. The problem is for the employers who are struggling. Businesses are struggling, right? And so I think we just need to keep watching. If you're in the process now and you're struggling with it, there are ways to deal with it. There are ways. It's getting more and more important, more and more required to have a good professional on your side. It used to be the case that things were a lot easier, but it's now more and more imperative that you find a good lawyer or a good immigration advisor to support your application and help you get through. Because if you have a genuine need and you call the immigration call center, hi, what's happening with my visa application, you're not going to get very far. Yeah. So that's it about employer accreditations and renewals and what I see going on in the market at the moment. Stay tuned for other updates, and we'll come at you with another video as soon as we can.